She was buried alive in mud, broken, and left to die, but God wasn't done with her yet. A silent little boy, who hadn't spoken in 7 months, followed a light only he could see, and what he uncovered would change everything. A dying German shepherd. A glow in the darkness. A second heartbeat no one believed was real, until it cried. This isn't just a story about rescue. It's about divine purpose, hidden strength, and the quiet ways God sends his angels when the world turns cold. Stay with us. You're about to witness a miracle. The air in Little Rock, Arkansas, hung cool and damp as late autumn whispered through the trees like a ghost returning home. It was one of those crisp November mornings where fog clung to the ground, and the sun barely pierced the gray sky, casting long, sleepy shadows across the cracked concrete driveways of the outer suburbs. In the last row of homes before the wilderness took over stood a modest beige house with a sagging roof and a squeaky screen door. It was here, on the edge of town where the asphalt gave way to pine needles and oak leaves, that Rachel Morgan lived with her 6-year-old son, Ethan. Rachel was a woman shaped by both tenderness and exhaustion. 32 years old, with narrow shoulders and an angular build that suggested a once curvaceous frame worn thin by grief and long hours, she moved with the cautious purpose of someone used to carrying too much. Her hazel eyes, once bright with wit, now held shadows beneath them, softened only by the fleeting smiles she gave her son. Rachel worked 2 jobs, morning shifts at a rundown gas station and evenings at a dollar store, and she wore her fatigue like a second skin. Her chestnut brown hair, often pulled into a fraying ponytail, had started to gray at the temples, but she rarely looked in the mirror long enough to notice. What had changed her most wasn't poverty, it was loss. 7 months ago, her husband, Kyle, had died in a car accident during a late-night grocery run. The truck skidded on black ice, veering into a ravine before anyone could react. Kyle died instantly. Ethan had been in the back seat. He had not spoken since. Ethan was a small child, slender and pale, with dark curls that constantly fell into his large, searching eyes. Those eyes, clear and gray like polished stone after rain, seemed too knowing for his age. Since the accident, he had become silent, inward. Not mute in the clinical sense, but quiet in a way that made noise seem offensive. The doctors called it trauma-induced selective mutism. Rachel simply called it heartbreak. Her son had retreated into himself, and words had become strangers to him. Yet he never screamed, never cried, not even in his sleep. He merely watched, listened, and felt deeply, intensely. Despite his silence, Ethan radiated an unspoken presence that animals seemed drawn to. A local stray cat, orange and battle-scarred, had followed him home one afternoon and now curled beside his feet each morning on the porch. Sparrows and blue jays flitted unusually close to him, once even landing on the railing where he sat. Mrs. Callahan, their elderly neighbor with a garden full of bird feeders and opinions, had once shaken her head in awe and declared, "That boy has eyes that speak louder than mouths. Like he's part of something older than this world." Rachel believed her. She had seen Ethan kneel quietly beside a fallen squirrel, eyes shut in silent empathy, or gently stroke the back of a frog without flinching at its cold skin. Words might have abandoned him, but he communicated in gestures, in stillness, in presence. And in the rare moments when he allowed himself to smile, soft, fleeting half-smiles, they seemed like gifts from a secret world he alone could see. Their home sat against the border of a dense stretch of woodland that locals called the Ridge. It wasn't marked on tourist maps, but everyone in Little Rock knew it. The Ridge had an unspoken reputation, a place where kids dared each other to enter on Halloween, where old hunters told stories of strange animals and echoes that didn't belong. Rachel didn't believe in ghosts or forest spirits, but she didn't like the idea of Ethan playing too close to it either. Yet the Ridge was also beautiful, a tangle of pine and oak, mossy rocks, and winding animal trails, alive with the rustling of deer and the distant calls of barred owls. On that particular morning, Rachel was running late for her second job and scrambling to get a load of laundry on the line. The backyard was scattered with forgotten toys, and a rusted swing set missing one chain. As she pinned a damp t-shirt, she glanced toward the woods and spotted Ethan sitting cross-legged near the property line, where the mowed grass bled into untamed brush. He wasn't moving, just watching the forest, hands folded in his lap, with the orange cat curled against his knee. "You can play out here for a few more minutes, but stay where Mommy can see you," she called out, though she knew he wouldn't answer. He never did, but he turned his head slightly and gave the tiniest nod, acknowledging her. Rachel smiled, a tight curve of the lips, then returned to her laundry. As she hung the final sheet, the breeze shifted. The wind carried a scent of wet leaves and something deeper, decay perhaps. She shivered. A moment later, a sudden rustling near the fence made her glance up. The cat, who had been dozing peacefully beside Ethan, now stood alert, tail puffed, eyes fixed on something in the trees. Rachel's heart squeezed. Ethan, however, remained seated, calm, still, as if listening to something only he could hear. She called his name again, softly, nervously, but he didn't move. The cat hissed once and darted back toward the house. Ethan slowly raised his hand, not to wave, but to gesture at something in the air, an almost imperceptible motion. Then he turned and looked back at his mother. For the briefest moment, Rachel thought he was about to speak. His lips parted, eyes wide, not with fear, but wonder. But then he closed his mouth, dropped his gaze, and returned his attention to the forest. Rachel stood frozen, a clothespin still in her hand, the wind tugging at the sheet between them like a curtain rising on a stage. In the background, the trees whispered. Nothing moved, yet something shifted. It was a moment. Subtle, strange. She couldn't explain it later, even to herself. But somehow in her bones she knew something had changed. She looked at her son, her silent, strange, heartbreakingly beautiful boy, and felt both awe and apprehension. Something in the ridge was stirring. And Ethan, without saying a word, was already listening. The sky above Little Rock darkened with a suddenness that made the air feel heavier, as if the clouds themselves were holding their breath. Thunder rolled somewhere distant, not yet angry but low and persistent, like a warning knocking at the edge of the forest. The sun that had peeked through earlier had vanished behind a sheet of gray, and the wind now rustled the dying oak leaves with purpose, twisting them into the air before letting them fall like wounded birds. It was late afternoon, and Rachel Morgan was on her knees in the backyard garden, trying to pull the last of the stubborn weeds from around the overgrown rosemary bush. Her hands were caked in cold dirt, her hoodie sleeves rolled up to the elbows, and her boots half sunk into the soft, damp ground. Ethan had been playing with his usual quiet stillness a few yards away just moments ago, sitting cross-legged near the back fence, tracing circles in the dirt with a stick while the orange stray cat, now dubbed Pumpkin, dozed beside him. Rachel had checked on him periodically as she worked, always finding him within sight. But now, as she looked up instinctively, there was only Pumpkin. The cat was pacing along the edge of the trees, tail twitching, ears angled toward the forest. Ethan was gone. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She stood, eyes scanning the yard, the distant trees, her voice rising as she called, "Ethan?" There was no answer. The air had stilled, as if everything around her had taken a step back to watch. "Ethan, sweetie, where are you?" Her boots thudded against the earth as she rushed toward the treeline. The fog that had been hovering low all morning was beginning to swell, crawling across the grass and up through the woods like fingers pulling her forward. Her heart pounded, chest tightening with every unanswered call. She ducked under the sagging wooden fence and entered the ridge, what the locals called the stretch of forest that sloped behind their neighborhood like a brooding animal. Rachel had always kept Ethan away from here. The trees were dense, the footing uncertain, and the legends about this place, though ridiculous, unsettled her. A few feet in, she found the first sign, a small footprint pressed deep into the soft mud of a narrow path. Another a few yards ahead, then another. Rachel broke into a run, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts as she followed the trail. The underbrush whipped at her jeans, and thorny vines tugged at her sleeves. The air smelled of wet bark and moss, and somewhere high above, thunder cracked sharply, closer this time. She rounded a bend and froze. There, in a shallow clearing, was Ethan, on his knees, his hands clawing at the earth. His face was streaked with mud, and his fingers were raw. He didn't look up. He didn't flinch. He just kept digging with a frantic, focused rhythm, as if he were trying to reach something, or someone, beneath the ground. "Ethan!" Rachel's voice was hoarse with panic. She stumbled forward, falling to her knees beside him. "What are you doing? What is it?" But he didn't answer. He didn't even acknowledge her. His small hands scooped another clump of mud, revealing something beneath, fur. Rachel gasped. She leaned closer, brushing more dirt away, and there it was, a snout. Muzzle first, then a closed eye. A German shepherd, half buried in the earth, its body trembling, chest barely rising. Its coat was soaked and matted, streaked with mud and blood, and its legs were contorted unnaturally beneath it. Rachel's stomach turned as she saw the wire, rusted and cruel, wrapped tight around the animal's hind legs. A thin chain was fastened around its neck, looped through an iron stake driven deep into the ground. It had been buried alive. "Oh my God," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking. She turned to Ethan, but his eyes were locked on the dog's face, his expression unreadable but burning with intent. He had found her. He had known. Rachel's hands moved on instinct, pulling the earth away, tearing at the wire. The dog whimpered, a sharp, high-pitched sound like a child stifling a scream. Rachel paused. "It's okay," she murmured, voice trembling. "We've got you. Just hang on." Her fingers slipped on the wire. She pulled a small gardening knife from her back pocket, meant for weeds, and began slicing through the bonds. The metal fought her, bit into her palm, but she didn't stop. Rain began to fall, light at first, then steadier, soaking her sleeves, turning the dirt around them into sticky muck. The dog shifted slightly as more of her body was freed. Rachel could now see the swell of her belly, round, tight, unmistakably pregnant. Her ribs jetted out sharply beneath the stretched skin, and her breathing came in shallow bursts. She was close to giving birth, maybe even in active labor. "We have to move her," Rachel said aloud, mostly to herself, partly to Ethan, who still hadn't spoken. He just nodded once and reached out to gently touch the dog's paw, muddy fingers brushing the matted fur. The dog didn't flinch. Rachel unzipped her hoodie and slid it off, using it to shield the dog's face from the rain. She glanced around. There was no way she could carry the animal alone, especially not in this terrain. She would need something to move her, something flat. The branches snapped behind her, and she whirled, heart in her throat. It was Mr. Langston, their neighbor from 2 doors down, a wiry man in his 60s with a weathered face and a permanent scowl etched into his features. He wore a hunter's vest over a flannel shirt and carried a walking stick that doubled as a cane. "Heard you yellin'," he said, eyeing the scene with a mix of suspicion and surprise. "You okay, Rachel?" "I need help," she said quickly. "This dog, she's pregnant. Someone buried her out here. I need to get her home." Mr. Langston grunted, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Damn people. Who does something like that?" He knelt with difficulty, joints creaking, and helped Rachel clear more mud from the dog's side. "I got a sled tarp in my shed. Big enough to drag her out. I'll be back in 5. She nodded, heart thudding. As he disappeared into the trees, Rachel glanced back at Ethan. He was now whispering, not words, but a low, tuneless hum. The dog's eyes fluttered open. Rachel stared. They were amber, deep and burning, unlike any animals she'd ever seen. And they were looking not at her, but at Ethan. The rain had settled into a cold, relentless drizzle, soaking the woods in a quiet, mournful rhythm. Water streamed down Rachel's face as she knelt beside the injured German shepherd, her arms wrapped around the shivering body. Beside her, Ethan crouched silently, his soaked hoodie clinging to his small frame. Though he hadn't spoken a word, the look in his eyes was louder than any scream. It was not fear. It was urgency. Desperation. A silent plea that cut through the roar of the wind like a blade. Rachel glanced at her son, then back at the dog, mud-caked, trembling, and unnaturally still. The patches of fur along her flank were thinned and blood-matted, and her eyes, still locked on Ethan, blinked slowly, like the last flicker of a candle fighting the dark. Rachel shifted the animal gently, careful not to cause more pain, and gasped when she saw the full extent of her injuries. A length of barbed wire had been twisted around the dog's hind legs, biting into the flesh, the rust staining the fur a sickly brown. Worse, a thick iron collar was fastened around her neck, bolted to a chain that had been driven into the ground with a rusted spike. Whoever had done this hadn't just tried to hide her. They'd wanted her to suffer. Rachel's hands trembled as she reached for the gardening knife again, fingers red and slick with rain and blood. She carefully worked at the wire first, the barbs tugging at the skin with each movement. The dog whimpered softly, a sound so raw and restrained it tore at Rachel's heart. Ethan, still holding the animal's front paw, pressed his forehead gently to her side. "Almost there," Rachel whispered. "Hang on, sweetheart." It took nearly 10 minutes to free the legs. Then came the collar. The bolt was old, but thick. The knife wouldn't cut it. She needed something stronger. Her mind raced. At home, in the garage, there was an old pry bar. It wasn't ideal, but it might be enough. She looked at the dog, at her son, at the woods beginning to dim with the coming dusk. Just then Mr. Langston returned through the trees, dragging a faded orange sled tarp and carrying a bolt cutter slung over his shoulder. "Didn't think this little blade of yours would cut that monster," he muttered, nodding toward the chain. "Figured I'd bring the real stuff." Relief washed over Rachel. Thank God. Langston bent with a grunt and positioned the cutter over the chain. One sharp squeeze, and the metal snapped with a crack that echoed through the trees. The collar fell loose, and the dog slumped slightly, breathing hard but free. "I'll help you drag her out," Langston said. "But you better get her seen by a vet. She ain't gonna last long in this shape." "I know," Rachel said. "She's pregnant. We need to get her inside warm." Together, they lifted the limp dog onto the sled tarp, Rachel cradling the swollen belly with practiced care. The rain intensified as they pulled her through the woods, the tarp catching on roots and rocks. It took nearly 20 minutes to reach the edge of Rachel's yard, and by then, Rachel was shivering, her muscles aching, soaked to the bone. They brought the dog to the back porch and laid her down gently on a folded blanket. Rachel rushed inside, returning with more towels and a faded floral bedsheet. She covered the animal as best she could, then turned to her son, who had followed quietly, his bare hands clenched tightly at his sides. "I'm calling the vet," she said. "Stay with her, okay?" Ethan nodded and knelt beside the dog again. His small fingers stroked her ears gently. The dog's tail thumped once. Rachel ran inside and grabbed her cell phone, dialing with fingers that trembled with urgency. It rang 3 times before the familiar voice of Dr. Greg Wallace answered. Greg was a large, bearded man in his 40s with laugh lines around his eyes and a deep voice that carried both calm and certainty. He had run the local veterinary clinic for almost a decade and had been Rachel's go-to since Kyle passed. He'd known her husband, had once treated his sprained ankle after a drunken 4th of July accident. "Greg," she said, breathless. "It's Rachel. I found a German shepherd. In the woods. She was buried, tied up, she's pregnant. She's hurt." "Slow down," Greg said, his tone instantly serious. "Is she bleeding?" "Not heavily, but her legs are torn up. And she's in labor, I think. You need to bring her in right away." "I can't. My car, Kyle's truck, it's still in the shop. And I can't leave Ethan here." There was a pause. "I'm 40 minutes out. I just left to pick up supplies in Benton. Do you have anything to keep her warm? Any sign the puppies are coming?" Rachel looked out the window. The dog's body had started to tremble in waves. Her breathing had changed, short, shallow, almost rhythmic. "Yeah," she said. "It's starting. Then you need to bring her inside. Try to keep her comfortable. I'll get there as soon as I can." Rachel hung up, shoved the phone in her pocket, and burst back onto the porch. The wind slapped her face with cold rain. She turned to Langston. "Can you help me get her inside?" He nodded, no questions asked. They moved the dog carefully through the sliding glass door and laid her down in the bathroom on the thickest blanket Rachel had. The room was small and warm, the space heater humming gently in the corner. Rachel stripped off her wet hoodie and knelt beside the dog. Ethan sat nearby, his back against the wall, eyes fixed on the animal with an intensity that felt larger than his small frame. The dog's breathing quickened. "She's going into labor," Rachel said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Langston lingered in the doorway. "You call that vet?" "He's on his way." "All right. I'll be out front if you need me." He gave her a nod and stepped out. Rachel turned back just in time to see the first contraction seize the dog's body. She placed a steady hand on the swollen belly. "It's okay, girl. You're safe now. We've got you." The dog's eyes closed. Her body tensed, and the first faint whimper filled the room. The bathroom was a quiet storm of breath and tension, lit only by the yellow glow of the overhead light and the flickering space heater in the corner. The tiles were warm beneath Rachel's knees, but her legs ached from kneeling. She hadn't moved in nearly an hour. Outside, the storm continued to murmur against the windows, a distant rhythm that echoed the contractions racking the German shepherd's body. Her sides heaved with each effort, and her paws twitched restlessly, pressing against the folded towels Rachel had layered beneath her. Rachel stroked the dog's head gently, whispering whatever soft reassurances she could think of. "You're doing good, girl. Just a little more." The dog had already delivered 3 puppies, tiny, wriggling things, still slick with birth, their eyes sealed shut as they instinctively sought warmth and milk. Rachel had dried each one with an old towel, helping them latch on. Ethan had not left her side. He sat tucked in the corner, arms wrapped around his knees, his wide gray eyes fixed on the scene with a solemnity far beyond his 6 years. The dog, whose eyes now blinked slowly with exhaustion, let out another low whine. Rachel placed a steady hand on her flank as another contraction rippled through her body. The 4th puppy arrived with a wet gasp, squirming weakly. Rachel moved with practiced care, cleaning it and setting it gently beside the others. Then came the 5th. Smaller, Still. Too still. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she picked up the pup. It was limp in her hands, its tiny chest unmoving, its tongue lolling out between pale gums. She rubbed it briskly with a towel, hoping to stimulate breath. Nothing. She pinched the tiny ribcage, gently pumping. Still nothing. Her eyes welled up. No, no, not you, she whispered. Come on, baby. Come on. She didn't notice Ethan moving until he was beside her. He reached out a hand, barely touching the puppy's damp fur. And then, in a voice so small it was almost part of the air, he said, "Live." Rachel froze. It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. But it was clear. Soft, certain. Ethan's voice. His first word in 7 months. The puppy gave a sputter. A faint, hiccuping squeal. Its legs twitched, and it drew in its first shaky breath. Rachel gasped, pressing the pup to her chest in stunned disbelief. Ethan, he didn't look at her. His hand remained on the puppy, his eyes locked on it as it wriggled in her arms. But his lips trembled, and when she reached out and pulled him into her embrace, he didn't resist. He melted into her, sobbing against her shoulder. Rachel cried too, not just from relief, not just from awe, but from the flood of something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. The bathroom door swung open. Dr. Greg Wallace stood there, shoulders dusted with rainwater, his vet bag slung over one arm. His beard was soaked, and his expression was all business until he caught sight of Rachel kneeling with the puppy in one arm, her son clinging to her side. "What happened?" he asked, quickly closing the door behind him. "She had 5, Rachel said, voice shaking. "The last one wasn't breathing." And then, she trailed off, unable to finish. Greg knelt beside them, his large frame surprisingly graceful. He inspected the puppies with practiced hands, checking breathing, reflexes, temperature. "They're stable," he said, nodding. "The mother's exhausted, but her vitals are holding." He moved to the dog and gently pressed a stethoscope to her side. "No more puppies. 5 total. Good size for a shepherd. You did great, girl." The dog gave a low, tired whine. Greg smiled and gave her a gentle scratch behind the ears. "Strong mama." Rachel exhaled slowly. "She needs a name." Greg nodded. "You thinking something powerful?" "I was thinking." Rachel looked at Ethan. "Sage." The boy blinked and gave the tiniest nod. Greg grinned. "Suits her. Smart, strong, full of grace. That's a name that sticks." As he began packing up, Rachel stood and guided Ethan toward the hallway, letting Sage rest with her pups. The house felt changed, warmer somehow, as if something ancient and kind had awakened. Rachel placed a gentle hand on Ethan's back as they sat together on the worn sofa in the living room. She watched her son in silence, wondering what had shifted inside him, what bond had sparked between him and the dog, between one broken soul and another. He didn't speak again, but he didn't need to. The way he looked toward the hallway, toward Sage and her newborns, was enough. Later that night, with Ethan asleep beside her on the couch and the rain having finally faded to a whisper, Rachel made a bed for Sage in the corner of the living room, using every spare blanket she had. She sat beside the dog for a long time, stroking her fur as the puppies nursed, listening to the rhythmic sound of their tiny breaths. Sage looked up at her, eyes calm, glowing faintly in the lamplight. Rachel whispered, "You saved him too, didn't you?" And somewhere inside, she felt a shift, the beginning of something larger, something holy in its quiet way. The kind of healing that didn't need words to explain. The morning sun broke weakly through the clouds, casting long pale rays across the dew-drenched grass of Rachel Morgan's backyard. The storm had passed, leaving the world wet and heavy with the scent of earth and pine. Inside the modest single-story home just outside Little Rock, everything felt calm for the first time in days. Sage lay curled on a nest of blankets in the living room corner, her 5 puppies nestled against her belly. Their tiny bodies rose and fell in gentle rhythm, like waves lapping against the safety of a shore. Ethan sat cross-legged a few feet away, watching them with unblinking fascination. One of the smaller pups, a cream-colored one with a single dark stripe along its back, had wiggled out of the bundle and was now trying to climb onto Sage's front paw. The mother dog nudged the pup closer with her nose, her eyes flicking toward Ethan. Again, there was that strange stillness between them, a quiet exchange Rachel couldn't quite explain. She had just finished a call with the auto shop and was in the kitchen pouring coffee when the phone rang again. The landline of all things. It startled her. Only sales calls or very old family friends used it anymore. She picked it up. "Hello." A man's voice, smooth and practiced, came through the line. Is this Rachel Morgan? Yes. This is Agent Henry Rowan with the Department of National Animal Behavioral Research. I'm calling in regard to a dog currently in your possession, female, German Shepherd, recently recovered from the woods behind your property. Rachel froze. Her grip on the phone tightened. I what? She is not a stray. Her designation is Aquila K9-09. She was part of a federal program and is considered classified property of the U.S. government. I'll be arriving at your address at 9 a.m. tomorrow to retrieve her. There was a moment of stunned silence. Rachel's heart pounded. She was buried alive. We're aware of the situation, Rowan replied, unshaken. There's an internal investigation underway, but that does not alter ownership. The dog is part of a biosensory research unit under contract. I trust you'll have her ready. Click. Rachel stood motionless in the kitchen, phone still in hand. Her coffee had gone cold. She slowly turned toward the living room, where Sage had lifted her head slightly, ears perked, eyes alert. It was as if she knew. The next few hours passed in a daze. Rachel couldn't stop pacing. Ethan didn't ask questions, he rarely did, but he never left Sage's side. At one point, Pumpkin the cat leapt up onto the couch and curled beside him, purring low and steady, as if anchoring something fragile. Rachel went to her bedroom, grabbed her laptop, and sat cross-legged on the bed. She typed in Aquila K9-09, but found nothing. Then she tried combinations: Aquila Canine Program, Military Dog Project Aquila, Aquila Sensory German Shepherd. Finally, a buried forum post caught her eye. A user had anonymously posted a string of allegations tied to a now-defunct defense subcontractor. Project Aquila, biosensory units capable of detecting human emotional states, elevated cortisol, fear responses, possibly used in interrogation or crisis prevention. The post included blurry images, canine silhouettes tethered in labs, a whiteboard listing variables like scent map trauma retention, and nonverbal emotional decoding. Another post theorized these dogs weren't just trained. They were bred, raised from birth in isolated facilities, designed to bond with humans based on biosignatures and subconscious cues. One line jumped out at her. Subject 09 marked highest empathy-to-threat ratio. Early failure predicted. Disappeared during reassignment. Rachel closed the laptop, her hands shaking. She went to the living room. Sage looked up at her as she entered, then gently lowered her head back to the floor. Rachel sat down slowly beside Ethan, wrapping an arm around him. Someone's coming for her tomorrow, she whispered. Ethan looked up at her. No, she blinked. It was the second word he'd said. Just one word, but full of quiet defiance. Rachel kissed the top of his head. I don't want to give her up either. That night, she couldn't sleep. She tried, tossing beneath the covers, listening to the soft whimpering of the puppies in the other room. At 1 a.m., she got up, crept to the living room, and watched Sage for a long while. Then she made a decision. The early morning light painted the Morgan home in pale gold, but the air inside was thick with quiet tension. Rachel hadn't slept. She sat curled up in the armchair, legs tucked beneath her, a blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. Across the room, Sage lay on her side with the 5 puppies nestled close, their bellies round from nursing. One paw twitched occasionally, and her ears flicked as if reacting to sounds only she could hear. Ethan sat cross-legged beside her, just as he had for the past 2 days, his small hand resting gently against Sage's fur. He had barely moved since waking, his eyes focused on the dog's belly, brow furrowed in a way that looked far too serious for a 6-year-old. Rachel sipped cold coffee and watched him. The last few days had changed everything. Ethan had spoken twice. And not just words, but words that meant something. Words that carried weight. The idea that the trauma of Kyle's death had begun to lift brought hope, but it also came laced with a strange, growing unease. She didn't understand what was happening. Not really. And now, with the looming arrival of Agent Rowan, time felt like it was folding in on itself. Rachel stood and moved to gather laundry when Ethan suddenly spoke again, calmly, clearly, as if the silence of 7 months had never been. There's another one. She froze. He didn't look at her. His fingers were tracing slow circles on Sage's flank. There's still one more. She told me. Rachel set the laundry basket down slowly. What do you mean, sweetheart? Ethan turned to her, eyes steady. She said there's a baby still inside. It's stuck. Rachel felt her stomach twist. Ethan! They're all here. 5. We counted. He shook his head. There's one more. It has a star. She walked over, knelt beside him, and brushed his hair from his forehead. Are you sure she said that? He nodded. Rachel exhaled slowly and reached for her phone. Okay, then we check. 15 minutes later, Dr. Greg Wallace arrived again, this time looking more tired than usual. His jeans were stained with mud, his gray hoodie pulled up over his head, damp from a brief drizzle outside. He carried a small portable ultrasound kit in one hand and rubbed his eyes with the other. You said there might be another one? He asked, kneeling beside Sage. Rachel hesitated. Ethan, he says there's still one inside her. A sixth. But, Greg glanced at Ethan, who was watching him intently. Well, let's find out. He unpacked the machine with smooth efficiency, plugged in the battery, and gently applied gel to Sage's belly. The dog didn't resist. Her breathing remained steady, and her eyes stayed on Ethan the entire time. Greg moved the probe slowly across the dog's side. The screen flickered to life, black and white patterns moving in rhythmic pulses. He frowned, adjusted the settings, then froze. What the hell? Rachel leaned in. What is it? Greg pointed at a faint, isolated mass tucked deeper than the others had been. He's right. There's one more. It's lodged higher up near the diaphragm. That's why we missed it. It didn't move down with the others. He turned the screen slightly. And look at this. He pointed to the fetal image, highlighting a distinct white shape in the center of its chest. That looks like a marking. Almost like a star, Ethan said softly. Greg blinked, then looked at Rachel. This isn't normal. Rachel didn't speak. Her pulse thundered in her ears. It's viable, Greg said. But we need to act fast. If it doesn't come out naturally within the next few hours, it could go into distress. What can we do? I need to prep for a minor procedure. It's not a full C-section, but I'll have to help manually. It's delicate, but I've done it before. You okay with me doing it here? Rachel nodded, though her voice caught in her throat. Yes. Please. As Greg began to set up, Rachel pulled Ethan aside and knelt in front of him. Honey, how did you know? He looked at her with an honesty so raw it stunned her. She told me. When I was sitting with her. She said it was scared. Alone. That I needed to help her. Rachel felt her breath catch. Did she talk? She asked hesitantly. Ethan shook his head. Not like words. Just feelings. Rachel stared at her son, unsure whether to be afraid or amazed. Within the hour, the procedure began. Rachel held Sage's head gently, whispering to her while Greg worked carefully. Sage didn't struggle. She trusted them. Ethan sat on the floor, arms wrapped around his knees, silently watching. And then finally a soft, wet sound filled the room. Greg held up the tiny puppy, barely bigger than his palm. She's breathing. Heart strong. Rachel reached for a towel, and together they cleaned the last-born. Her fur was pale gold, almost white, and on her chest, in stark contrast, a dark star-shaped marking bloomed like an ink spill. Ethan held out his hands. She's the last. Rachel placed the puppy gently into his arms. And for a moment, everything stopped. The wind, the questions, even the fear of tomorrow. All that existed was the boy, the dog, and the tiny life he had somehow known was waiting. The wind picked up around 8 a.m., whistling low through the trees that bordered Rachel's backyard, bending the yellowing autumn leaves until they clung desperately to their branches. The Morgan house sat quiet under a steel-gray sky, its windows rattling softly with each gust. Inside, the air was anything but calm. Rachel paced in the narrow kitchen, mug of untouched coffee clutched in both hands. Ethan sat at the table drawing quietly, a picture of Sage surrounded by stars and swirls. Across the room, Sage lay near the fireplace, head up, ears stiff, her body tense despite the warmth and comfort of the blanket beneath her. The puppies lay nestled beside her, unaware of the brewing tension. At precisely 9:03 a.m., there was a knock at the door, firm, deliberate. Not the knock of a neighbor. Rachel's heart skipped. She walked to the window first. Outside, a black SUV sat at the curb. Two men stood on the porch, one tall and angular in a tailored black coat, silver hair slicked neatly back, the other younger, stockier, with a military buzz cut and dark sunglasses, even though the sky offered no sun. Rachel opened the door halfway, keeping her body angled. Ms. Morgan? The older man's voice was identical to the one on the phone, calm, polished, with a practiced lack of warmth. That's me. I'm Agent Henry Rowan. This is my associate, Agent Keene. He held up a badge and a folder of documents, pressing them toward her like a formality he had no intention of being questioned about. We're here for the retrieval of government asset Aquila K9-09, formerly designated for Project Tequila. Rachel didn't move. Her name is Sage. Rowan blinked, unmoved. That's not relevant. The animal was not legally relinquished and must be returned to federal custody for evaluation. These are the papers confirming that status. I want my vet here for this. Rowan tilted his head slightly, as if indulging a child. You had 24 hours. That was generous. Behind him, Keen stepped forward. Rachel noticed something cold and reptilian in his gaze, like a man used to obedience and unimpressed by resistance. Sage, visible from the living room, let out a low, guttural growl. Wait here, Rachel said, then shut the door. She moved quickly through the house and found Greg Wallace pulling into the driveway in his mud-spattered Ford Ranger. He stepped out carrying his veterinary bag, his flannel shirt only half tucked into worn jeans, face creased with concern. The rain had begun again, light but insistent. They're here, he asked. They're outside. Sage started growling the second she saw them. Can you stop them? Let's try. They stepped into the living room. Greg knelt by Sage immediately, checking her vitals with a gentle hand on her belly. Sage's breathing was faster, her eyes locked on the door. Then came another knock, harder this time. Greg opened it. Rowan's expression was polite but sharp. Sir, this doesn't concern you. I'm her attending veterinarian, Greg said calmly. And I'm advising against any relocation of the dog. She's just given birth, underwent manual intervention, and any stress could cause hemorrhaging or hormonal collapse. You remove her, you risk killing her and the pups. Rowan's lips barely moved. She is not your patient. She is classified property. I swore an oath, Greg replied, voice firmer now. She's under my care. You want to take her, you'll have to go through the county health board, and likely animal welfare too. There's paperwork. Rowan's eyes narrowed. And how long do you expect that to take? Before Greg could answer, a voice rang out from the gravel walkway. Depends on who's filing the injunction. Officer Dana Mercer approached from the side yard. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with thick auburn curls pulled into a tight braid. Her badge glinted from her belt. Dana had worked the local beat for 10 years, and though Rachel didn't know her well, she had always spoken with straight-back clarity. She walked with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged exactly where she was. Officer Mercer, Rowan said with a forced smile. This isn't your jurisdiction. Actually, Dana replied, producing a printed document from her folder. It is now. I just received a civilian protection request regarding a possibly abused animal, and until that's resolved, she's staying put. Rowan's expression didn't change, but the tension in his jaw was unmistakable. He didn't argue further. He merely glanced at Keen, who remained statuesque behind his sunglasses. Dana continued, I've seen dogs freeze or cower around strangers. I've never seen one growl like that unless they remembered something. That's not just instinct. That's memory. Sage barked once, sharp and deep, as if punctuating the statement. Ethan appeared at the doorway, his small hand wrapped around the last-born puppy with the star on its chest. He stared at the two men with quiet defiance. Rowan looked from the boy to the dog, then back to Rachel. You're interfering with federal property. No, Rachel said calmly. I'm protecting a mother. And a victim. The wind howled again, shaking the porch rafters. Rain began to fall harder. Rowan closed his folder. We'll return. He turned sharply, Keen at his heels, and marched back to the SUV. The vehicle pulled away, tires hissing against the wet street. Rachel let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Sage slumped into the blankets again, the tension bleeding out of her muscles. Rachel reached for Ethan and hugged him tightly. Dana placed a hand on her shoulder. They'll be back, but I'll be here when they are. Night had fallen early. The clouds hung low, swollen and heavy, sealing the world in darkness hours before it was due. The town's streetlights flickered dimly as Rachel Morgan drove down the winding backroads of Pulaski County, her hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel. The narrow two-lane road cut like a ribbon through the dense pine forest, and each mile felt like a heartbeat lost between fear and determination. Beside her in the passenger seat, Ethan sat bundled in his jacket, his wide eyes reflecting every flash of light through the trees. His small hand clutched a blanket-wrapped bundle, Star, the last-born pup with the star-shaped mark on her chest. The puppy slept peacefully, occasionally emitting a soft, glowing pulse from her chest that flickered like a faint night light. At first, Rachel had thought it was a trick of the headlights, but now she wasn't sure of anything anymore. In the back seat, Sage rested on a nest of blankets, her eyes alert despite the exhaustion in her body. She had refused to lie down the entire trip. Her ears flicked constantly, nose twitching, and occasionally she let out low rumbles that Rachel could only guess were warnings. The other puppies, secured in a lined carrier next to her, whined softly but stayed mostly quiet, as if sensing the tension. They had been driving for nearly 2 hours. Rachel's phone was turned off and stuffed into the glove compartment, the battery yanked out just to be safe. Agent Rowan hadn't returned yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. What they were doing wasn't legal, but it was right, and sometimes that had to be enough. The cabin came into view just after they crossed the narrow wooden bridge spanning Twin Creek. It was old, tucked deep into a thicket of dogwood trees and pines, invisible from the main road and overgrown with moss along its stone foundation. Greg Wallace had given her the keys only hours ago, pressing them into her palm with a quiet urgency. My grandmother lived out there until she passed. No power, no Wi-Fi, just wood heat, a hand pump for water, and a roof that mostly holds. No one will look there. Rachel stepped out first, boots sinking into the damp, leaf-covered ground. The cold bit sharply at her cheeks, and the wind carried the scent of pine and rain. She walked to the cabin door and unlocked it. The hinges groaned as it opened. Inside was musty but dry. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a single cot sat beneath a window draped in a faded blue curtain. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight. She returned to the car and brought Ethan inside first, then the carrier of puppies, then Sage, who stepped cautiously through the doorway, sniffing every surface. As Rachel lit the first fire and unpacked what little food she'd brought, she found an old notebook tucked beneath the floorboards. Leather-bound, the edges curled with age. Without hesitation, she opened it and began writing. Day 1. We're safe for now. Sage is resting. Ethan hasn't spoken again, but he doesn't need to. He knows. Something is happening here, something no one will believe unless I record every detail. If anyone finds this, know that we didn't run because we were afraid. We ran because the truth is too big for silence. Later that night, Ethan stirred from his sleep on the cot and sat up straight. Someone's close, he whispered. Rachel looked up from the floor where she sat beside Sage. What? He stood and crossed the room to the window, peering out into the dark forest. Stars glowing again. Rachel looked at the puppy, who was curled against her siblings. The mark on her chest pulsed gently, but then, as the wind rattled the windows, it brightened, just for a second, like a heartbeat of light. Sage's ears perked. She stood slowly, placing herself between the front door and the children. Her muscles tensed, tail low but rigid. Rachel grabbed the shotgun Greg had left in the cabin. It was old and heavy but loaded. She crept toward the front door, listening. There, footsteps. Someone was moving through the woods. More than one. Suddenly, Sage stepped forward, turned toward the back wall, and let out a strange low whine, soft, melodic, like a hum. The air around her shimmered. Rachel blinked. Where Sage stood, a second image of her appeared, an illusion so precise it made Rachel's breath catch. Then another, and another. Within seconds, 5 identical Sages stood inside the cabin, each one growling low and pacing. The puppies remained still. Ethan didn't flinch. Somehow, he had expected it. From outside came voices, brief, clipped commands, rustling leaves, the click of a safety being released. Then silence. Rachel didn't dare breathe. A shadow passed the front window. Then came a crash. Something slammed into the porch, followed by a frantic thud thud thud, and silence again. She peeked through the crack in the curtain. A man in black tactical gear was sprawled across the porch steps, moaning. His weapon lay a few feet away. Another figure sprinted back toward the tree line. The illusions flickered once, then vanished. Sage stood tall, calm now. The real one. Rachel stared at her, heart hammering. What did you just do? Ethan turned, his voice barely above a whisper. She protected us. Rachel crouched beside Sage, who nuzzled her hand with a quiet rumble. Star's glow faded once more. Rachel opened the notebook again. She can create projections, illusions. I don't know how, but it saved us. One of them fell on the porch. I didn't check if he was still breathing. I can't think like that right now. I just know Sage isn't just a dog. She's something more. And maybe so is Ethan. The sun hadn't fully risen, but light was slowly seeping through the cabin's frost-fogged windows, casting long, golden fingers across the wooden floorboards. A chill still lingered in the air, though the fire from the night before had kept them warm enough. Rachel stood in the doorway, arms wrapped tightly around her sweater, watching Sage and the puppies. Star lay curled around Ethan's feet, the boy now humming a soft tune he had begun whispering the night before, A tune he said came from inside Sage's thoughts. He was speaking again. Not just one-word answers, but entire sentences, slow and careful, often directed at the dogs. Rachel hadn't pushed. She knew better than to ask why or how. For now, she was simply grateful. A truck approached around 9 a.m., its tires crunching over fallen branches and gravel. Greg Wallace climbed out, looking grimmer than Rachel had ever seen him. But he wasn't alone. From the passenger side stepped a woman, tall, wiry, with an air of unshakable focus. She wore black cargo pants tucked into hiking boots, a thick olive-green parka, and a dark wool cap pulled low over her ears. Her hair, gray at the temples, was braided tightly down her back. Her face was angular, pale but kind. "This is Dr. Lena Briggs," Greg said, stepping forward. "Former behaviorist and canine neurologist for the Tactical K-9 Research Division out of Virginia." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "So, government?" Briggs shook her head. Her voice was low, even-toned. "Not anymore. I left after Aquila." Inside the cabin, Sage's ears twitched the moment Briggs entered. The German shepherd stood, eyes narrowing. Her posture was protective, but not aggressive. Briggs knelt slowly, palms open. "Easy, girl. I'm not here to hurt you." Sage didn't growl. She simply stared, intently, knowingly. Briggs seemed to accept that as permission. The examination was quiet and thorough. Briggs moved with practiced ease, touching Sage's temples, checking her eyes, her paws, and eventually her neck. She then reached into her bag and pulled out a portable scanner, compact and rectangular, with a screen that flickered to life with a quiet beep. Briggs passed the scanner along Sage's spine. There was a soft chirp. "Here," Briggs said, pressing gently just below the nape. "There's a chip. Not a normal one." Rachel moved closer. "What kind of chip?" "Neuralink transmitter. Rare, illegal now. It was part of a classified phase in Project Aquila. The goal was to enhance certain breeds, mainly shepherds and Belgian Malinois, to detect emotional shifts and chemical cues more accurately than standard service dogs." Greg interjected. "I remember hearing rumors. Some kind of empathic training protocol." Briggs nodded. "More than that. They experimented with light-based stimuli, projecting optical responses, false images created in the target's field of vision, triggered by emotion or memory." Rachel stared. "You mean illusions?" "Yes. Sage was one of them. I remember the ID tag, Aquila K9-09. She was supposed to be the most promising subject until the final trial broke protocol. Too much stress. Too many synthetic links between the chip and her natural brain chemistry. She vanished during the facility breach. We thought she was dead." "She's not," Rachel said. "She saved us last night." Briggs looked down at Star, now blinking up at her with impossibly bright eyes. "And this pup?" Rachel hesitated. Ethan stepped forward. "Her name's Star," he said clearly. "She glows when there's danger." Briggs raised an eyebrow. "Pardon." Ethan pointed to Star's chest. "It gets bright like a nightlight, but only if someone bad's coming. And she shows me pictures in my head. Like a map." Rachel swallowed hard. "He says she can guide us. Not just with instincts, but with something else." Briggs sat back slowly. "That wasn't part of the program. This is something else entirely." Greg asked, "Could it be genetic mutation?" "Unlikely. Project Aquila had no bioluminescence markers. What we're seeing here may be either a dormant recessive gene, or something triggered by Sage's trauma, passed to the litter. This pup could be the first of her kind." Sage nudged Star protectively, then turned her gaze toward Rachel, soft, unwavering. Rachel sighed. "We can't keep running. We need answers." Briggs nodded. "Then we need to remove the chip. Carefully. Before they track her again." "I can assist," Greg offered. "But it'll have to be done here. I don't have the tools for neurosurgery, but I can localize the signal and try to deactivate it temporarily." "Do it tonight," Rachel said. "We don't have time." Ethan sat cross-legged by the fire, Star curled into his lap. He whispered something, eyes closed. The pup blinked, then looked toward the front door. "Someone's coming," Ethan said simply. Rachel stood. "Now." He nodded. Briggs didn't panic. She pulled a slim black case from her coat. Inside were 3 syringes. 2 are sedatives. One's an optical cloaking agent we used in training. It'll mask Sage's outline from infrared scanners for 20 minutes. She handed one to Rachel. "Just in case." Rachel took it with a trembling hand. As the shadows outside grew longer and the wind picked up again, The small cabin suddenly felt like the center of something much bigger than any of them had imagined. They were no longer just hiding. They were protecting something humanity had failed to understand. And maybe, for once, they would be the ones to write how this ended. The air hung thick with tension, heavy with the scent of burning cedar from the fire and the dampness of an approaching storm. The forest outside the cabin stirred with wind, and beyond it, something darker moved with intention. Rachel stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the treeline. She didn't need Ethan to tell her, they were coming. Agent Rowan. Armed. Determined. Inside the cabin, preparations were underway. Dr. Lena Briggs sat cross-legged on the floor, her medical bag open in front of her, rechecking the status of the deactivation device she'd used the night before to temporarily disable Sage's neural chip. She had dark circles under her eyes, her braid messy, her parka tossed aside to reveal a fitted tactical vest. She looked exhausted but composed. Greg Wallace stood by the back door, holding an old hunting rifle he'd taken from a hidden cabinet beneath the floorboards. He wasn't a man of violence, short, stocky, more academic than action, but his jaw was set with a quiet resolve. "We don't shoot unless they do," he said. Sage stood by Ethan, her posture alert but calm. Her golden brown fur, still slightly matted from days of stress and dirt, shimmered slightly in the low firelight. The 7 puppies lay tucked together in a blanket-lined box near the hearth, Star curled protectively around them. Every so often, Star's chest would glow with a soft pulse. Then Ethan would whisper something, nod, and turn back to Rachel. "He says they're close," Ethan murmured. "But there's a way out." Rachel knelt beside him. "A way out?" He looked at Star. "She showed me a tunnel. Behind the woodshed. Grandma's root cellar, remember? But it goes deeper." Rachel's heart thudded. The root cellar? She'd only glanced at it once since arriving. Just a pile of old stones, and a trapdoor sunk in the ground. It had looked like it hadn't been opened in years. "Star showed you this?" Lena asked, stunned. Ethan nodded. "Not just showed. She felled it into me." Greg blinked. "You mean projected the map directly to you?" Ethan didn't respond, just grabbed Rachel's hand and started pulling her toward the door. Outside, wind lashed through the trees. Rachel rushed to the woodshed, her flashlight beam catching on the moss-covered hatch. She yanked it open. Beneath was a narrow staircase leading into darkness. Old stone steps descended into what looked like a dirt tunnel, supported by wooden beams, still surprisingly sturdy. They gathered quickly. Greg helped lift the puppy box. Rachel carried Star in her coat. Ethan clung to Sage's fur, and Lena brought up the rear, sealing the door behind them. From the cabin, they could already hear the first engines, for maybe 5 vehicles. Then voices, boots crunching gravel. The storm began to break overhead, rain sweeping across the forest like a curtain. The tunnel was longer than expected, winding and damp, but still intact. At some point, it split into 2 paths. Star let out a soft whine, nose twitching, and moved toward the left fork. The glow on her chest flickered, then brightened as if affirming it. "Trust her," Ethan whispered. They emerged nearly 30 minutes later in a thicket behind a rusted fence bordering an overgrown property. A faded wooden sign swung crookedly on broken hinges. Pine Hollow K9 Rescue closed. The property had been abandoned for years. But someone had been keeping it alive in secret. Lights flicked on from the inside of the old barn. A tall, wiry man in his 60s stepped out. He had weathered skin, a shock of white hair, and a limp in his right leg. He wore a faded sheriff's jacket and carried a flashlight and a thermos. "Briggs," he called. "Hello, Harold," Lena said with a breath of relief. "We need shelter." Harold didn't hesitate. "Come in." Inside, the barn had been converted into a sanctuary. Cages long disused were now lined with blankets. There were medical supplies, heat lamps, even a few rescue dogs already present, watchful but calm. It was the last safe place Lena knew, once used to care for dogs injured in military service or test programs that had been deemed non-essential. Rachel placed the puppies down in a large pen. Sage laid beside them, exhausted but vigilant. Lena approached Harold. "We'll need to send out evidence. Records. Proof. Or they'll erase all of this." Rachel reached into her pack. She handed over the leather-bound journal. "I've written everything. About Sage. About the illusions. About Star. Every ability, every moment. They'll read it." Harold nodded. "I've got press contacts. Independent. Not bought. I'll get it out before midnight." By dawn, the world had changed. News of the journal exploded across independent networks first, Then larger ones picked up the story. Government documents were leaked. Former handlers came forward anonymously. Whistleblowers confirmed the name, Project Aquila. Within hours, protests flared online and outside facilities that had once been silent. Rachel stood outside the barn as morning sun broke through the trees, casting rays across the mist-covered ground. Ethan sat on a stump nearby, Star nestled in his lap. He looked up, eyes clear. "I'm going to protect this world," he said softly, stroking the pup's back. "Like Sage did for me." Rachel crouched down beside him, pulled him into her arms, and finally, felt the weight of fear begin to lift. Sometimes, miracles don't come with flashing lights or angelic choirs. Sometimes, they arrive in the quiet strength of a German shepherd who refuses to leave your side. In the whisper of a child's first words after months of silence. In a puppy's glowing chest guiding a mother and son through darkness. This story reminds us that God's protection often comes in unexpected forms, through creatures he created with wisdom beyond our understanding. Just as Sage was more than a dog, she was a protector, a healer, a miracle. So too may we open our hearts to recognize the silent ways God watches over us. In our daily lives, we may overlook signs of grace, a stranger's kindness, a child's laughter, the loyalty of a pet who senses our pain. But these are no accidents. They are gentle nudges from above. We pray today that God continues to work through the small, the broken, and the unlikely, to shine light into the hidden places of our lives. If you believe that love, protection, and healing can come from God's creatures, say amen in the comments. May the Lord bless everyone watching this story. May He send you guardians in fur, in feathers, or in flesh, just when you need them most.